Every day, this country pumps more oil out of the ground than any other nation in Africa. Over 1.5 million barrels, enough to make it one of the richest economies on the continent. And for 60 years, it could not make its own petrol. It sold its crude oil to the world. Then it bought the finished fuel back at a loss and paid the difference to keep it cheap. Cheap. More than 200 million people live here. Nearly half of them. This is Nigeria, the giant of Africa. This is in Africa. And this is the story of how a country this rich stayed this poor. My Azisahud sized my over a tickered, twisted, if it thankful known of the grey advesti, if this is knowance eu dividity, and you reminding it togethery. This eu dividity, kun for Untold de Goldent stayed versing as did. This is how 54 nations. The stories Africa was never told. This is episode 2. Nigeria was not built by Nigerians. In 1914, a British colonial administrator named Frederick Lugard drew a single border around 2 territories that had almost nothing in common. To the north, a vast Muslim region of emirs and ancient cities ruled indirectly through its own leaders. To the south, a patchwork of hundreds of ethnic groups ruled directly by British officials. These 2 worlds were not joined because it made sense for the people inside them. They were joined because the North was running a deficit and the wealthier South could pay for it. It was an accounting decision. The name Nigeria was coined by a British journalist after the Niger River. One country, one border, drawn to balance a colonial budget. Inside that border sat more than 250 distinct ethnic groups, 3 of them large enough to dominate. And when the British left, all of them were handed a single state and told to share it. The cracks were built in from the first day. On the 1st of October, 1960, Nigeria became independent. The hope was enormous. This was the giant of Africa, huge, young, and sitting on oil that had just been found in the Niger Delta. But the state itself was fragile. Within 6 years, the army had seized power in a coup, then a counter-coup, then something worse. In 1967, the southeastern region, home to the Igbo people, declared itself an independent nation. It called itself Biafra. What followed was one of the worst famines of the 20th century. The Nigerian government blockaded Biafra by land and by sea. Food could not get in. Estimates of the dead vary widely, from around 500,000 to as many as 3 million. But most agree that roughly 1 million people, many of them children, died of starvation. The images of that famine traveled the world. Biafra surrendered in 1970. Nigeria stayed whole, but it had learned that it could hold itself together by force. And that lesson shaped everything that came after. For most of the next 3 decades, Nigeria was run by soldiers. Coup after coup. And the oil money kept flowing, which meant that whoever held the capital held a fortune. The most notorious of them took power in 1993. General Sani Abacha ruled for 5 years. In that time, investigators estimate he stole somewhere between $3 and $5 billion, moving it through banks in Europe and beyond. Years after his death, governments were still tracing the money and sending it back. Abacha became a global byword for one thing: kleptocracy, the rule of theft. But he was not the disease. He was the symptom. The machine underneath him was simple. Oil money flowed to whoever controlled the government, not to the people the government was meant to serve. Roads, power stations, schools, hospitals, the things a rich country builds were promised for decades and mostly never came. The lights, famously, kept going out. Here is the paradox that defines Nigeria now. It is Africa's largest oil producer. Oil and gas make up the overwhelming majority of its export earnings and a huge share of government revenue. And yet, by 2024, the World Bank estimated that nearly half of all Nigerians, around 47%, were living below the national poverty line. In just 5 years, tens of millions more people had fallen into poverty. And here is the detail that captures the whole tragedy. For decades, Nigeria's own oil refineries barely functioned. So the country did something almost absurd. It exported its crude oil, paid other countries to turn it into petrol and diesel, and then imported that fuel back. And it subsidized it, so citizens could afford it. Nigeria was, in effect, paying twice for its own oil. Why should anyone outside Nigeria care? Because this is the most populous country in Africa, and one of the youngest on Earth. By the end of this century, it is projected to be one of the most populous nations in the world. What happens to Nigeria will shape the whole continent and a large share of humanity's future. And right now, that story is being rewritten. In 2023, a newly elected government did something no leader had dared to do. It removed the fuel subsidy, overnight. The cushion that had kept petrol cheap for generations was gone. Prices exploded. The currency was floated, and it collapsed against the dollar. Inflation surged past 30%. For ordinary Nigerians, it was brutal. But at the same time, something was being built that could change the equation for good. On the edge of Lagos, a Nigerian billionaire named Aliko Dangote had spent years constructing the largest single refinery on the planet, 650,000 barrels a day. In 2025, it finally reached full capacity. For the first time in living memory, Nigeria could refine most of its own fuel, instead of shipping crude out and buying petrol back. And in 2026, something happened that would have sounded impossible a decade earlier. Nigeria became a net exporter of petrol, not just crude, the finished product. The country that could never make its own fuel started selling it. Whether this fixes the deeper problem, the 60-year gap between what Nigeria earns and what its people receive, is genuinely unknown. A refinery is not a government. Cheap fuel is not a functioning state. But for the first time in a very long time, the giant of Africa is refining its own future instead of exporting it raw. More than 200 million people are waiting to see if this time is different. Next episode. Ethiopia. The only nation in Africa never colonized, and yet still fighting, a century later, to hold itself together and drag itself into the modern age. 54 nations. The stories Africa was never told, one at a time.